right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having us, Elise, and for letting us come share with you all about the Small Business Credit Survey. You may have heard of it, you may not have. It's an effort that we at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, but then also across the system, have participated in years past. And so we're really excited to have some new partners in Delaware this year. And really our Fed team is here today to talk to you just about some of the benefits from completing the survey for your business, but then also just to the larger regional economy in Delaware as well. So thank you so much for having us. I'm Sloan. I'm going to be able to pass it on to two other colleagues in just a little bit. But before I do that, I will go ahead and just share our Fed disclaimer. So the views expressed here are those of us, the presenters, and do not necessarily reflect those of other Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia colleagues or the bank itself or the Federal Reserve System. So if you've been on a Fed panel before, you're familiar with this disclaimer, and thanks for bearing with us as we move through that. I also just wanted to take a second before we jump into the Small Business Credit Survey to just talk to you a little bit about what the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia does and what the community development function of the Fed, the Philly Fed does. So if you aren't familiar with our work, this should give you just a little bit of background. But our dual mandate includes both price stability, so inflation, and maximum employment for regional economies. So that's really the driver of our work in community development, is how we can support both of those pieces of our mandate while also prioritizing our low to moderate income communities and families that are within our district to create a more inclusive and mobile economy for all of the residents in our communities. And so you can see on this map here, we cover most of Pennsylvania except for the far western part of the state, the whole state of Delaware, and southern half of New Jersey. So we are the smallest Federal Reserve Bank district, but as you can see on here, we actually cover 4.6% of the country's population, even though we just cover 1% of the actual physical land. So like I mentioned, our function in community development touches a lot of different economic and community development topics, from housing to small business to workforce development. But we're really excited to be here with you all today to talk about small business and some of the work that we are engaged with the small business community in the 3rd Federal Reserve District, but then also on a national scale. So if I haven't met you before, I'm excited to meet you. I'm Sloan again. I'll be the liaison throughout the Small Business Credit Survey response period. So feel free to reach out to me with any questions, but I'm actually going to, at this point, turn it over to two of my colleagues. First, we'll have Ashley Putnam, who's the director of our Economic Growth and Mobility Project, and then Elena Barca, who is a researcher on our community development team, and she will be leading the research aspect of our Small Business Credit Survey effort this year. So with that, I will go ahead and pass it to Ashley and let her introduce herself and talk to you a little bit more about the survey.
Great. Well, thank you, Sloan, and I'm so excited to be here. This is a very exciting day for us at the Federal Reserve Bank because it is also the first day the Small Business Credit Survey launches. So I will tell you a little bit more about that. But by means of introduction, as Sloan mentioned, I lead our strategic initiative at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. That is the Economic Growth and Mobility Project, and that launched just about 5 years ago. And so I'm happy to tell you a little more about what we do there and how that ties into the Small Business Credit Survey. So the Economic Growth and Mobility Project really focuses on 3 key pillars of what we think are necessary for both economic growth and economic inclusion. And those are infrastructure, so things like transportation, housing, broadband, workforce development, and job creation. And today's conversation is really salient for us because it is something we think is really important for really building inclusive economic growth. And that is leveraging local resources, local talents, and local businesses to create a virtuous cycle for regional economies. So what does that mean? And what does that look like in our work? Well, so first of all, the way we do that work is really by thinking about the intersection of research and practice. So, we produce just incredible work at the Federal Reserve Bank in terms of our research, but we really want to make sure that research is useful and salient to stakeholders like all of you so that it can help inform decisions you're making. And so we call these engagements research and action labs. They are community driven, they're innovative, they're actionable, and they really, again, sit at that intersection between the work you all are doing out in community and the research we produce at the Fed. So a couple things about why we think small businesses are really critical in this cycle, this virtuous cycle of the economy. So first of all, we know that in all of the regions we represent in the 3rd district, there is local talent that's often left on the sidelines. And when we invest in that talent, that helps create innovation. And those people who create innovation start businesses. They create local businesses, which then in turn create jobs, which then in turn create local wealth. So this is part of the reason why we do this work at the Economic Growth and Mobility Project, because we know that the work of small business owners, so for those of you who are listening today, if you are a small business owner, we know that the work that you're doing is really critical to economic growth and economic inclusion. We really want to think about how we can support small businesses in our region and in our economy. So why are small businesses important to economic growth? Why does the Federal Reserve care about talking about small businesses? First of all, we know that small businesses employ about 48% of private sector workers in the United States. So that's nearly the majority of private sector workers work in a business that has less than 500 people. We also know that small firms create economic opportunity and local community, and they drive innovation in the larger economy. Given this national significance, this information that we collect, this timely information on economic conditions, on financing needs, and on credit availability is really important to inform the work that we do as well at the Federal Reserve. So this is where it comes to the Small Business Credit Survey. So the Small Business Credit Survey is a survey that we do every year. And we have just opened the survey today. And so I'm really excited to invite you all to participate in the Small Business Credit Survey and share with you a little bit about what you can get from participating and what we get in terms of the Federal Reserve, what we are learning from all of you. So why would you want to participate in the Small Business Credit Survey? And yes, Sloan has dropped the link in there. And so if you're listening to this, hopefully on the webinar version also, you can click on the link and go take the survey. It usually takes only about 10 to 15 minutes to complete. And we're really excited to be working with folks in the state of Delaware and the Newcastle Chamber of Commerce, as well as quite a few other stakeholders in Delaware to learn about what's happening with Delaware small businesses. So what is the Small Business Credit Survey? So again, as I mentioned before, small businesses are critical to the US economy, but the data and the research we have is really actually quite limited, especially data on how and why businesses seek financing. So again, at the Federal Reserve Bank, we are working with financial institutions, and we're really interested in what's happening with small businesses in terms of access to credit and capital. That could be emergency credit and capital, like the Paycheck Protection Program, where we've learned a lot through the Small Business Credit Survey. Elena will share a little bit more of what we've learned from the survey in years past. That could also be just regular forms of financing, lines of credit, or whether or not small businesses are using their own credit or personal credit to try to make it through. Those things that we learned from that survey really do inform how we work with financial institutions and what we think about the work we do in terms of what we do at large at the Federal Reserve. So the Small Business Credit Survey captures one-of-a-kind data. It is really unique for us as the Federal Reserve also because we are, again, an apolitical, independent, decentralized bank. And it puts us in a unique position to collect, analyze, and distribute this data and think about how that can inform lots of other stakeholders beyond just us at the Federal Reserve and the interest we have between research and practice. So why should you participate and why is it important to you? So by taking the survey, we know small business owners can contribute that data that directly informs the Fed, as well as other federal government agencies. Those include service providers, policymakers, and others who are ultimately benefiting from this data that we're collecting. And we hope that that benefits not only your business, but other businesses like yours. The survey takes, again, 10 to 15 minutes to complete, and it's open for for-profit businesses with fewer than 500 employees. That's the condition. Responses are confidential, and small business owners do not need to provide any personal information whatsoever. So you are able to complete the survey, share your experiences, share what you've been through, and that really does, again, inform policymakers and others, not just at the Federal Reserve, but across the country. So we encourage you to take the survey today. It is open now until Friday, November 4th.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ashley. So that's just, a little bit of what the survey actually is, some of the value that it can add to the efforts that we're taking underway in the Federal Reserve System, but also hopefully to our local businesses and the local economy. So I'm going to, at this point, go ahead and pass it over to Elena Barca, who's our researcher on our community development team. And she's just going to talk a little bit more about how the data is used and what types of products it can help inform, and then also, just some of the important elements that we need in order to be able to use the data. So Elena, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you.
Thank you, Sloan. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Elena Barca. I'm a researcher with the Philadelphia Fed, and I conduct research with the data that's actually produced from the Small Business Credit Survey. So I'm going to share a bit about what folks do with the data that comes from the survey, both nationally and locally, and then share some qualifications and kind of thresholds that Delaware would have to meet as a state in terms of the number of responses that it gets, which would give Delaware access to some really, really rich state level data. So the next slide gives a brief overview of the value of the SBCS data itself. Like Ashley said, the data that the survey produces, which I'm going to talk a bit more about later, is used to create reports that directly inform the federal government agencies, service providers, and policymakers, which ultimately benefits small businesses by elevating their voices. So participating in the survey gives businesses an opportunity to voice the challenges and conditions that you're experiencing, and have their voices actually be heard by people who can actually make the changes needed. So the survey data is also really valuable because data on small businesses is quite limited, as Ashley mentioned. And finally, I just want to reiterate this because it is really important. The Fed puts a lot of importance on its data security as an institution, and the data collected from the survey remains confidential, and there are strict rules about how the data can be shared to maintain that confidentiality. So with that, I want to highlight on the next slide some of the reports and products that come out of the SBCS data. On a national scale, responses contribute to many reports that focus on various topics for all US small businesses. So just this year alone, we've already seen reports from last year's survey data about employer firms, firms owned by people of color, hiring and worker retention, and online lender applicants. So these reports get a ton of press and attention with the institutions that we listed before, meaning they're actually reaching the hands of people who can impact the policies and services that small businesses are using. And then on a more local scale, we at the Philadelphia Fed have produced a number of publications over the last few years that focus specifically on states within our region. So on the next slide, as Sloan described, we cover portions of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and then all of Delaware. So this year and last year, we put out a series of briefs based on the data for states in our region. We also produced a report specifically about conditions for small businesses in New Jersey across race, firm size, and other characteristics, and then a similar report specifically for the Philadelphia Metro as well. I will say in terms of the state level briefs, the past few years, we've been able to put out state level briefs for both New Jersey and Pennsylvania, but unfortunately we haven't had enough respondents for Delaware to look at it as a state alone. So in the past, we've broadened the third brief of the three to look at all states in our district at the same time. So last year we put out a brief for Pennsylvania, a brief for New Jersey, and then a brief that looked at the aggregate data for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware combined. But we're hoping, which I'll talk more about later, given the amount of demand and momentum that we're seeing among our partners in Delaware for this data and this information at the state level, we're hoping that we'll be able to get Delaware to meet the requirements this survey round to produce state level data for all of next year's products. So the next slide is just a snapshot of some of the data that was included in this year's state level briefs for our region. So these are from the New Jersey brief. Each brief covered topics like current firm conditions, operational challenges, financial challenges, as well as a bunch of results regarding emergency financing, PPP forgiveness, and revenue changes. Another product that comes out of the SBCS that's on the next slide that I want to touch on are two things: the Appendix data and the Firms in Focus site. The national SBCS team does some really great work on making the data that's used for their reports accessible to the public. So along with employer firms, that report on employer firms that was on that lineup of national reports, they release a beautiful Excel workbook with all the summarized data that makes up the figures in the report. And so for any state that qualifies for state level data, you're able to filter for that state's data using the appendix. And then along with that, the national team also puts out a series of slide decks called the Firms in Focus, which are full of a bunch of public data that visualize the results from the appendix data, so no data experience needed, for particular geographies, including state data. So they also include national level comparisons. So for example, I pulled the New Jersey slide deck from the website and included one of the first slides here, which visualizes firm reported revenue change in the last year for New Jersey firms. alongside a national comparison. And a lot of these slides look similarly, where they have the New Jersey results or the state level results, ideally for us Delaware next year, and then a comparison of how Delaware stacks up next to the nationwide results. So there's a lot of good data in both of these resources and all of the ones I've listed before, and they all come out of the survey. So I hope I've made a good case for why small businesses should participate in the survey, not only to contribute to the national level data that comes from it, but also so that Delaware can meet the requirements to qualify for state level data for the upcoming survey year. So on the next slide, I've spoken a lot about what Delaware could do if it reaches the requirements for state level data. So let's talk about what those requirements actually are. In terms of respondents, any for-profit business with fewer than 500 employees qualifies to participate in the survey, including if they're currently in operation or recently closed or about to launch. In terms of whether or not a question ends up being reported at the state level, it's dependent on the number of responses for that question. So even for a state that qualifies for state level data, if there are fewer than 50 responses among the state's respondents for a question about, say, PPP forgiveness, that question about PPP forgiveness will not be reported at the state level for that state in the publicly available data. And finally, probably most importantly, for a given state to qualify for state level data at all, it needs to meet the following. The state must have at least 100 observations, and also for select variables have a standard error under a threshold. And I know the standard error requirement is kind of ambiguous sounding, but the action needed on the survey collection and completion side is actually pretty simple. Standard error is reduced primarily through completing the survey entirely and more respondents overall. So a state might qualify in terms of the number of respondents who complete the survey, but not by the second qualification of that standard error. And this could happen if, say, 100 people completed the survey, but maybe only half of respondents actually completed the questions that are selected for that standard error test. So the more people who complete the survey, the more likely it is that there will be enough observations to clear that standard error threshold. And as per the note on the bottom of this slide, it's super important for respondents to complete the entire survey so we can ensure they pass that standard error test. So main takeaways in terms of trying to get Delaware the state level data are try to get as many respondents as possible. So share with your networks, try to get as many people to complete the survey as possible, and ensure that surveys are completed entirely. Because working toward these two goals are going to help us meet the criteria to get the really rich state level data that we want for Delaware, which is going to ultimately help get the needs of Delaware small businesses into the hands of people who are actually making the local decisions and providing the services. So with that, thank you so much for your attention and your interest in the survey. I'm going to turn it back to Sloan to close us out.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Elena and Ashley, both for sharing more details about the survey. So I just want to kind of close this out by reiterating, the call to action is really to complete the survey, like Elena mentioned, share it with your networks. It's really just the requirement is that a business employs less than 500 people. And for Delaware, this is also a really exciting year for us. As Elena and Ashley both mentioned, we have a lot of partner momentum, and we haven't been able to have some of these products for Delaware in the past. But we're really hopeful that this year it will be something that we'll be able to share back with the community and the small business community once we hit those thresholds and those numbers. Also, I will say that it is really exciting because some of our stakeholders in Delaware have been working really hard advocating for the state to also start collecting demographic data. And they just integrated demographic data collection option into the one-stop system. So if you're renewing your business license this year, be sure to check the box and offer that information. It's all part of a coordinated effort that has similar goals as the Small Business Credit Survey, which is ultimately to have data around the full scope of businesses in Delaware in order to best support them and have the most accurate picture of what is really propelling the economy forward in Delaware. So really excited that has been added into the state's business license system. And finally, I'll just say and mention Let us know if you have any questions. I put my email on the slide. The survey period is open until November 4th. So there's time. And like Ashley mentioned, it really only takes about 15 minutes. And I'll just reiterate again, your data will remain completely confidential. And, you know, some of the questions are pretty detailed. And so your survey data will remain completely confidential. But it's just so critical that we have full and complete surveys in order to receive the benefits from the data. So yeah, so with that, I guess if there are any questions, happy to take them now. Otherwise, we can answer them if you think of them later through email.